Is it possible that everything has a mind? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher's Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. A popular view today is that the mind emerges from the brain. That is to say, you have the physical thing, the brain, and through its processes, a mind just sort of comes out of that. It's produced by that. The trouble is, when I think about properties that are produced or emerge from objects that are having their processes or whatever way they emerge, usually it makes a lot of sense. So, for example, a tire is round, so it has a property of roundness. Now, that roundness emerges from the subatomic particles of the tire, and those subatomic particles are not round. However, due to the way that they structure themselves, it's obvious that roundness must emerge. It necessitates roundness emerging for the tire. The trouble is with the brain, there's nothing about the brain that looks like it would necessitate a mind emerge. You know, if you were to look and see all the intricacies of the brain, you know, see it working with you know, everything firing and all the good stuff going on, you wouldn't look at that and be like, you know what's happening right there? I bet you a mind is emerging. Yep, absolutely. No, in fact, you would not have any clue unless you knew, you know, about your own brain and that kind of stuff. If you just saw a brain by itself, you'd have no idea. So, and the weird thing is, we've had years of neuroscience, and there's still lots that we don't know, you know, a ton that we don't know. And yet, with all the experience that we do have, we should have some semblance of the beginning of an answer to how consciousness would emerge from the brain. And it's not even close, you know, like we don't have anything like that. So we should have an answer, but we don't. At this point, saying that the mind emerges from the brain is tantamount to saying that the mind magically emanates from the brain. So we're stuck with this big fat question: how can consciousness emerge from non-consciousness? What if it doesn't have to? Panpsychism is the view that everything has a mind. And when I say that everything has a mind, I don't mean that everything can think. I mean that everything has at least some rudimentary form of consciousness. And when I say everything, I don't also mean every single object. So I don't mean like this book over here can think, right? But the building blocks of everything has some rudimentary form of consciousness. So the particles, subatomic particles that make up this book, those things have some level of consciousness. Now, the consciousness of each of those individual parts, when compiled together, make a new and bigger consciousness. And in the case of the brain, it makes eventually a human consciousness. And this is a concept we could call additive emergence. Unlike when we were talking about the tire and roundness, it would be more like if you had a choir of people singing very quietly, but it was a huge choir. Every individual part is singing very quietly, but as a whole, it's a very loud sound, right? So you keep adding the little parts together and you get a big thing that emerges. And what's great about this view is that you no longer have the problem of emergence that you had before. You know, whereas before we were looking at it like, how could the mind emerge from the brain? We could say, oh, well, there are already a bunch of minds there, and they just sort of come together to form the human mind, just like the neurons come together to form the brain. Now, you may wonder, why would somebody believe this? Because it's a big stretch, right, to believe that subatomic particles have some form of consciousness. One reason would be, like we saw just now, to answer this problem of emergence. There are other answers for the problem of emergence, so you know, this is going to have to compete with those. But that's one of the big reasons why panpsychist philosophers believe it. We're also going to talk about emergentism in a future video, so hang on to that, and we'll see, you know, if the problem of emergence is a problem. A second reason given is the intrinsic nature argument. And this goes something like this. Physical objects are known only by their extrinsic nature, by which I mean their behavior, the way they affect us or our measuring tools. So, for example, electrons. We only know about electrons, we know the way that they are disposed to act. They're disposed to, go towards a nucleus, but not go into the nucleus. And we only know that because of the way that they affect our microscope. But this doesn't tell us about the intrinsic nature of the electron. It doesn't tell us how the electron is in and of itself. And science in general can only tell us about the extrinsic nature of objects. It can't get inside of the object itself and tell us more about it. And in that sense, science has an incomplete picture of the world. So the panpsychist will argue, look, we're coming to the table and we're bringing a little extra, something that you don't have, a view of what the intrinsic nature of everything is like. And maybe not a complete picture, but at least we have something to say about it, which is that everything has got some kind of consciousness. So this would be more of just a supporting argument saying, hey, panpsychism adds something important. Of course, there are other views that also talk about the intrinsic nature of matter. So panpsychism would have to compete with stuff like Aristotelianism. And it could be the case that the inner nature of matter is totally opaque, not only to our senses, but also to our imagination, so that any kind of speculation would be impossible for us to have about the inner nature of matter. So that shows at the very least that you can't just throw out random speculation. You have to have plausible speculation as to what the inner nature of matter is. Another argument given is the simplicity argument, which goes something like this. Assume that Cartesian dualism is false. So we haven't really talked about Cartesian dualism yet, a little bit, I guess. But that's the view that the mind and the body are two totally distinct substances. Pretend that's false, okay? Every other view has the mind emerging from the brain, or not emerging necessarily, but the mind being connected to the brain, such that we would believe that there is an intrinsic nature of the brain, which is that it has consciousness. So we don't know what the intrinsic nature of anything else is. The simple thing to conclude would be that everything else is like the brain is, which is having consciousness. I think this is a hasty generalization. I don't think this is a very good argument at all. This is like arguing, when I was in the Air Force Academy, I met an exchange cadet from Africa, and he was super friendly and super nice and happy. And I thought, man, Africans are so nice, like it's incredible. And I met one African, and I concluded that about all Africans. Come to find out, there are such things as warlords, right? There are like atrocities committed in Africa, just like everywhere else. So I made a hasty generalization. I knew one thing, and then I applied it to everything else without having any reason to. That sounds like this, right? You know one thing, the brain, and then you're just going to apply it to everything else. I don't know. That sounds suspect, right? You have to give me some reason to think that other matter is going to be like the brain. Now let's look at some objections to panpsychism. And the first one is probably the most obvious to you, which is that it's deeply counterintuitive. Wildly counterintuitive. The idea that electrons have some kind of inner mind life. What are they experiencing? Joy? What is happening inside of an electron? It just sounds ridiculous. And I know panpsychists get upset when people criticize them about that. They say, hey, look, we got a viable view here, but it's just hard to take seriously without any kind of evidence whatsoever. We're left thinking, is it worth believing such a crazy idea just because it solves the mind-body problem? Assuming that it does solve the mind-body problem. The second objection is the combination problem. Imagine there are 1 billion conscious particles. And I know, like, in your brain, that's the wrong number of conscious particles there would be, but just pretend like a billion for my sake, because I don't know how many particles there are in the brain. So take a billion particles, all with consciousnesses, and push them together into a brain formation. Now, for the sake of argument, let's pretend like a human consciousness arises from that. But that human consciousness would not be a case of additive emergence like we saw before with the quiet voices and then the loud sound, right? It would just be a new consciousness that emerges. You would have 1,000,000,001 now consciousnesses. You'd have the billion consciousnesses of each of the individual particles, and then you would have one more, the human consciousness. So it's not like you put these things together and they add up to a human consciousness, right? Consciousnesses don't work that way. And that seems to be a devastating argument against this view, which is that the whole view is predicated on this idea of additive emergence, and consciousness is not something that adds up like that. This is most forcefully put in the subject summing problem. Each subject has a viewpoint that excludes all other viewpoints. That's just what it means to be a subject and not to be an object, right? It's that I look through my perspective and that's the only one I got, and other people can't look through my perspective. They have their own perspectives to look through. Now, let's say we have two subjects that are merged together. The consciousnesses are merged together. You and me, we come together to form the Voltron of consciousnesses. And think about that new consciousness. It's got my perspective that excludes all other perspectives, my point of view that excludes all other point of views, and your point of view that excludes all other point of views. But wait a second. Both of our points of views that exclude other points of views? How's that possible? That's a contradiction, right? It seems like you can't have two subjects that merge together like that. That would just be contradictory to what a subject is. So although panpsychism is great in that it gives us this answer to the problem of emergence, on the other hand, it seems like it's got these irreconcilable problems that just makes it untenable. Anyways, that's panpsychism. If you have any questions, please hit me up in the comments. Remember, the best philosophy always happens in dialogue, so let me know. What do you think about panpsychism? Do you think that there's a response to any of those problems? And I'll see you in the next video. Adios.